The night had fallen swiftly over the Nordic landscape, casting a long shadow over the snow-covered ground. The cold was relentless, the wind sharp like knives, slicing through the dark sky. In the distance, the trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches swaying in the icy gusts, and the horizon seemed a blur of white. The people who lived here had long since learned to accept the cold, to endure the harshness of the endless winters. For them, survival in this frozen north was not a matter of chance, but of necessity. They were Vikings, masters of the northern wilderness, and their homes were a testament to their ingenuity, built to withstand the most unforgiving conditions nature could offer. Imagine yourself standing there in the midst of the winter storm. The temperature drops far below freezing, and the howling winds cut through your clothes, chilling you to the bone. The ground beneath your feet is hard and unyielding, frozen solid. Snowdrifts pile up in the corners, and the sky is a permanent gray. There is no escape from the biting cold, except for the warmth that emanates from the heart of a Viking home, a beacon in the desolate wilderness. These homes, though humble by today's standards, were marvels of design, crafted with remarkable precision to ensure warmth and safety against the brutal winter that could last for months. The Vikings, ever resourceful and resilient, learned to use their surroundings, the very elements that sought to destroy them, to create sanctuaries in which they could survive and thrive. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as fierce warriors, charging into battle, swords raised high, their ships cutting through stormy seas. But their true strength lay in their ability to adapt and endure in an environment that seemed almost designed to destroy human life. They didn't just survive, they flourished. Their homes were an extension of their spirit, reflecting their connection to the land and their ability to conquer not only the battlefield but also the elements themselves. The Vikings faced challenges that few could comprehend. In the regions they inhabited, modern-day Scandinavia, Iceland, and parts of Greenland, winters were not simply cold. They were unrelenting, the sun a faint memory for days or even weeks at a time. The snow, often waist-deep, could trap entire communities, leaving them isolated for long periods. The wind was fierce, and the temperature could drop to levels that made it nearly impossible to venture outside without risking frostbite or death. Yet, despite the frozen expanse of their homeland, the Vikings' ability to withstand such extremes and build their homes for survival is a story of human innovation at its finest. Their homes were not just structures, they were refuges, fortresses against the cold, and symbols of their unbreakable spirit. A Viking's home was where life happened, where families gathered, where warmth radiated from the hearth, and where stories were shared long into the night. In this narrative, we will journey through time to discover the homes that the Vikings built, exploring the methods, materials, and techniques they used to carve out a life in one of the most hostile climates known to humanity. These homes were far from ordinary. They were works of art, shaped by the practical need to survive but also imbued with the wisdom and traditions of the Viking people. The architectural feats achieved by these early settlers were not just born out of necessity, they were products of a deep understanding of nature. The Vikings knew the land and they knew the seasons. They understood how to use the resources around them to not only protect themselves from the cold but also to stay connected to the very land that threatened to freeze them out. Their homes were built to work in harmony with nature, not against it. To truly understand the Viking winter home, one must first grasp the enormity of the challenge they faced. The North, with its brutal winters, was not simply a backdrop for Viking civilization, it was a force to be reckoned with. The homes the Vikings built were an answer to this force, a combination of survival, culture, and engineering that was far ahead of its time. At the heart of every Viking home was warmth. This wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. The hearth, the center of the home, was not only a place to cook food but also a source of light, warmth, and hope in the darkest of times. A flickering flame in the hearth could mean the difference between life and death in a snowstorm, and it was the center of all activity, where families gathered, children played, and warriors came home to rest. The hearth brought the warmth of community to a place that could otherwise feel cold and isolating. The Vikings didn't simply huddle inside their homes, seeking shelter from the elements. They designed their homes to be sturdy, practical, and durable. Their buildings had to withstand snow and wind, heavy rains, and the wear of time. The materials they used, wood, stone, and earth, were carefully selected not just for their availability but for their ability to combat the weather's harshest assaults. These materials weren't just for structure, they were tools for survival. As you imagine walking into one of these homes, you'd be struck by the sense of warmth that envelopes you. The smell of wood smoke fills the air, and the heat from the fires seeps into your skin. The walls, lined with animal skins and moss, hold the warmth of the hearth, creating a refuge from the freezing winds outside. In the center of the home, a great fire crackles and hisses, casting flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating the faces of those gathered around it. Here, the cold is kept at bay, and the long, harsh winter feels far away. In many ways, Viking homes were a reflection of the people who built them, resilient, adaptive, and deeply connected to the land. Their homes were not just structures for shelter, they were extensions of their will to survive. They were places where the Viking spirit thrived, even in the most extreme conditions. As we continue this journey into the heart of Viking winter homes, we will uncover the layers of innovation and perseverance that went into their creation. We will explore how these homes stood as beacons of warmth in a frozen world, where every element of their construction was carefully thought out to ensure survival, community, and culture. Through this exploration, we not only understand the practical realities of Viking life but also come to appreciate the emotional and spiritual connection that these homes represented, a connection to the earth, to their ancestors, and to the unbreakable Viking will to endure, no matter the cost. So, as the wind howls outside, imagine yourself inside one of these Viking homes, the fire crackling in the center, the warmth wrapping around you, and the storm outside feeling a world away. The Vikings built these homes not just to survive, but to thrive, and in doing so, they left us a legacy of resilience, ingenuity, and strength. In the vast, windswept plains of Scandinavia, winter was not just a season, it was an entire way of life. The Vikings, who are often remembered as fierce warriors, explorers, and seafarers, also had to contend with one of the harshest climates on Earth. The brutal winters that gripped the lands they called home were as much a part of their identity as their swords and shields. Their survival, and the ingenuity they developed to live through these frigid months, was an art in itself. It was a battle, fought not on the front lines of battlefields, but against the unforgiving forces of nature itself. Imagine waking up on a cold, winter morning in a Viking village. The darkness clings to the land like a heavy blanket, and the sun, if it appears at all, might only be a faint glow hovering just above the horizon. The temperature has dropped far below freezing, and the wind cuts through the landscape with a ferocity that feels like it could strip the flesh from your bones. The ground is hard, covered in layers of snow, and the trees, stripped of their leaves, stand like skeletal figures reaching up into the gray sky. The very air you breathe stings your lungs, sharp and cold, and yet you are compelled to rise, to move, to live. This is the Viking winter, long, dark, and seemingly endless. And within this harsh reality, the Vikings had to adapt. They didn't just face the cold, they learned to survive, to thrive, and to build a life in the heart of this frozen world. Viking life in winter was a constant battle against the elements. The cold was not simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The Vikings knew that exposure to the cold for even a short time could be fatal. Hypothermia, frostbite, and death from freezing were constant threats. For the Vikings, warmth was not just a luxury, it was a matter of survival. The longer the winter dragged on, the more critical it became to protect oneself from the biting cold, and this drive for survival influenced everything from how they built their homes to how they structured their social lives. Yet, despite the danger, there was an undeniable beauty in the Viking approach to winter. For them, winter was a time of both danger and opportunity. It was during these long, dark months that the bonds of family and community were tested and strengthened. The fierce cold kept people close, and the hearth became the heart of every Viking home. Families would huddle together, sharing warmth, stories, and food. The long, dark nights were the perfect time for the recounting of legends, for the passing down of traditions, and for the telling of sagas that would live on for generations. The hearth, where the fire burned brightly, was not just a source of warmth. It was where the Viking spirit truly came to life. But winter also brought other challenges. With the snow came isolation. The long winters of the north meant that communities often became cut off from each other, sometimes for months at a time. The Vikings lived in small, tight-knit villages, often nestled in valleys or along fjords, and during the worst of the winter, travel was nearly impossible. The roads were buried under thick snowdrifts, and even the mighty Viking ships, which could cut through the seas with impressive speed, were useless on frozen waters. This isolation meant that the Vikings had to rely heavily on their homes and their immediate communities to survive. While their ships were their tools for exploration and warfare, their homes were their sanctuaries during the long winter months. This connection to home, to family, and to the land itself became a central part of Viking life. The Vikings didn't just endure the winter, they celebrated it, finding ways to turn what could have been a time of despair into an opportunity for reflection, renewal, and bonding. The deep connection the Vikings had with the land was reflected in their homes. Unlike other cultures who may have built their homes for looks or convenience, the Vikings designed theirs with one primary goal in mind: survival. The Viking longhouse, which was the center of family and community life, was built to withstand the most extreme conditions. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a fortress against the winter cold, a shelter that allowed them to survive even the harshest of storms. But survival was not guaranteed. The Vikings knew that the winter could be deadly. The storms that rolled in off the sea could appear suddenly, and the winds could howl for days on end. The snow could bury a village, trapping its inhabitants until the spring thaw. In these extreme conditions, the Vikings had to rely on their resilience, their knowledge of the land, and their ability to adapt. Every decision they made, from how they constructed their homes to how they stored food, was aimed at ensuring survival. In the Viking mind, winter was a test. It was a test of endurance, of strength, of patience. But it was also a test of unity. The long, cold nights were not just an ordeal to be survived, they were a time for Vikings to come together, to share stories, and to bond as a family. In this way, winter was not just a time of isolation, it was a time for deep connection, for reaffirming the bonds that held the community together. The hearth became a gathering place, where the warmth of the fire symbolized not just physical comfort, but also emotional connection. The fire was a beacon in the darkness, a light in the long night of the soul. The Viking approach to winter wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about turning it into a part of their identity. Winter was both an adversary and an ally, something to be feared but also something to be respected and understood. The Vikings never shied away from the challenges that winter presented. Instead, they faced them head-on, using their ingenuity, their resourcefulness, and their sense of community to ensure their survival. They built homes that could withstand the most brutal of winters, developed techniques for storing food and keeping warm, and found ways to make life in the frozen north not just bearable but meaningful. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they made it a part of who they were. Their homes, their culture, and their way of life were shaped by the extreme conditions they lived in. In the grip of winter, they didn't just endure, they thrived. And through their ingenuity, their resilience, and their deep connection to the land, they created a legacy that would live on for centuries, inspiring generations to come. The lesson of the Viking winter is simple. In the face of the harshest challenges, the human spirit is capable of incredible strength. The Vikings didn't just accept the winter, they embraced it. They turned the most brutal of seasons into a time of unity, survival, and growth. Their homes were more than just structures. They were symbols of their unyielding will to survive and to thrive in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. The land the Vikings called home was shaped by forces more powerful than anything they could control. The climate of the north, with its relentless winters, was not just a backdrop to their lives. It was a constant adversary. It was a presence that dominated their existence, dictating the rhythms of their daily routines and the very survival of their communities. The Vikings did not simply live in this harsh environment. They were constantly at war with it, fighting not only for survival but for their very sense of self. Imagine standing on a fjord in the dead of winter. The landscape before you is vast and unbroken. a sheet of white snow stretching as far as the eye can see. The wind howls, icy and biting, slicing through your clothing as if it were nothing more than paper. The air is so cold it feels like it could freeze your breath mid-flight, hanging in the air like a mist before it dissipates. There is no shelter, no warmth, nothing to protect you from the harshness of the land. The sun, when it makes an appearance at all, barely rises above the horizon, casting a dim, pale light on the frozen world. It is a harsh, unforgiving landscape, one that would challenge the hardiest of souls, let alone those who sought to call it home. This was the Viking winter. It was a season of extremes, where the weather could shift from fierce snowstorms to periods of bone-chilling cold with little warning. The Vikings lived in a world where the natural elements were as much a threat to their survival as any invading force. The long winters, stretching from late autumn to early spring, could last for months, trapping villages in isolation and cutting them off from the outside world. The lack of daylight only compounded the harshness of the season, plunging the Vikings into weeks of darkness, where the sun barely kissed the land before retreating again behind thick clouds. But what made this environment truly brutal was not just the cold. The Vikings also faced an unrelenting wind. The Nordic winds could roar off the mountains and across the seas with a force that made even the hardiest Viking sailor think twice before setting out on a journey. These winds could freeze a man in minutes, biting into his flesh, and making travel not only difficult but often deadly. The Vikings knew the wind as one of their most dangerous enemies, a force that could knock down trees, cause avalanches, and bury homes under layers of snow and ice. The winters were so harsh that entire villages could be cut off from one another. Travel was nearly impossible in the deep snow, and the seas were often frozen over, trapping ships in their harbors. This isolation meant that Viking communities had to be self-sufficient, relying on their homes, their land, and their ingenuity to survive until spring came again. Food supplies had to be carefully stored and rationed, and every resource had to be used with great care. There was no room for waste or excess. The Vikings were keenly aware of the delicate balance that existed between survival and death in such a challenging environment. In this world of snow and ice, time itself seemed to slow down. The days stretched on endlessly, marked only by the rising and setting of the pale sun. The cold seemed to seep into every aspect of life. It was not just a physical cold, but a mental and emotional one. The isolation, the darkness, the never-ending chill, it all took a toll on the Viking spirit. But the Vikings, rather than succumbing to despair, turned this environment into a part of their identity. They adapted. They learned how to endure the cold, how to survive in a place where the very land seemed to be at odds with human life. One of the most remarkable aspects of Viking life in the winter was how they learned to use the elements to their advantage. The Viking home, the Longhouse, was built to withstand the fury of the northern climate. Every element of its construction was designed with the weather in mind. The Longhouse was a fortress against the elements, a place where families could huddle together for warmth, where the hearth in the center of the home would provide both light and heat, and where the walls, insulated with layers of earth, moss, and animal skins, would help keep the warmth trapped inside. The Viking homes were not just structures, they were vital instruments of survival. The cold that gripped the land also shaped Viking culture. The long winter nights were a time for reflection, for bonding with family and community. It was in the Longhouse, around the fire, that stories were passed down, legends were told, and the sagas of their ancestors were kept alive. It was a time when the bonds of kinship and loyalty were strengthened. While the wind howled outside and the cold crept through the cracks in the walls, inside, there was warmth, connection, and shared history. This was the beating heart of Viking life, a place of safety and togetherness amidst the storm. But the harshness of the northern climate also meant that the Vikings had to be innovative. They did not just build homes that kept them warm, they built homes that could withstand the constant battering of the wind and the heavy snowfall. Viking architecture was designed to endure, to hold fast against the forces of nature. The longhouses were often dug into the earth, with the earth itself providing an extra layer of insulation. The roofs were sloped steeply to prevent the snow from accumulating, and the walls were thick and sturdy, built to resist the constant pressure of the snow and wind. These homes were not just places to live, they were fortresses, carefully constructed to ensure that the Viking spirit would not be extinguished by the cold. The climate also affected the Vikings' daily routines. In the summer months, they might be out farming, hunting, or fishing, but in winter, they turned inward. They worked on repairs, crafted tools, and prepared for the coming spring. It was during this time that the Vikings also turned to their most valuable resource, each other. The long winter nights were a time for deepening relationships, for reinforcing the bonds of family and clan. The warmth of the hearth was not just physical, it was emotional, bringing people together in the midst of a world that seemed intent on tearing them apart. The cold of the northern winter was, in many ways, a test of Viking endurance. It demanded resilience, innovation, and unity. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they learned to live with it, to find ways to turn it into an asset rather than a burden. The homes they built, the fire they tended, and the community they formed were all part of their triumph over the harshest environment imaginable. For the Vikings, winter was not just a season, it was a part of who they were, a part of their identity as a people who could endure anything the world threw at them. In the end, the northern climate shaped the Vikings in ways that no other force could. It made them tougher, more resourceful, and more connected to one another. It made them a people who could not just survive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, but who could thrive. The cold, the wind, the snow, they were all forces that the Vikings respected, but they never feared. They had learned to live with them, to use them to their advantage, and in doing so, they created a legacy that would endure long after the last Viking ship had sailed. In the frozen expanse of the north, where the land is often as inhospitable as the weather, survival required more than just resilience, it demanded ingenuity. The Vikings, a people who thrived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, had to craft homes that could endure the weight of winter's fury. To build a shelter strong enough to protect them from the icy winds, the thick snow, and the bone-chilling cold, the Vikings turned to the materials most abundant in their landscape: timber and stone. These elements became the very foundation of their homes, and their use was a testament to the Vikings' deep understanding of the natural world around them. The vast forests of Scandinavia provided the timber that the Vikings needed to construct their homes. Tall, sturdy trees like oak and pine were common throughout the region, and the Vikings were expert woodworkers, using the timber to craft structures that could withstand the harshest conditions. Wood was the primary material in the construction of Viking longhouses, their most iconic form of dwelling. These longhouses, typically designed to house large families or even entire communities, were built with a frame of heavy timbers, carefully shaped and joined together to create a robust skeleton that could bear the weight of the snow and the wind. The Vikings' mastery of woodworking allowed them to create buildings that were both functional and durable, able to endure the violent storms that would often lash against the coast or sweep through the forests. Building with wood, however, was not as simple as felling trees and piling logs together. The Vikings had to be strategic in their use of timber, selecting only the best trees for their purposes. Pine, for instance, was often used for the frame of the longhouses, as it was both abundant and strong enough to withstand the weight of the roof. Oak, a much denser wood, was used for the foundation posts and for parts of the structure that needed to bear a heavy load. The Vikings understood the properties of different types of wood and how they could best be used in construction, selecting the right materials for each specific part of the home. This attention to detail ensured that the homes would stand up to the most extreme weather without deteriorating or falling apart over time. In addition to the timber, stone also played a crucial role in the construction of Viking homes. While wood provided the framework, stone was often used for the foundation and in areas where additional strength was needed. The Vikings were adept at working with stone, quarrying it from the earth and shaping it to fit their needs. The stone foundation of a Viking longhouse was essential for insulating the structure from the cold ground and providing stability against the wind and snow. In some regions, the Vikings even used stone for the walls of their homes, especially in places where timber was scarce or where stone was more readily available. The use of stone in combination with timber created a building material that was both sturdy and insulated, providing a perfect balance for the harsh northern climate. The construction of a Viking home was an intricate process that required a deep understanding of the environment. It wasn't enough to simply stack timber and lay stone. Each piece had to be carefully placed, each joint and beam perfectly aligned. The Vikings were skilled craftsmen, and their homes were a reflection of their ability to work with the natural world. When building a longhouse, the Vikings would start by digging a foundation trench, a process that helped to anchor the home securely into the ground. The trench would be lined with stones, ensuring that the structure was stable and less susceptible to shifting in the winter freeze. Once the foundation was set, the main beams were erected and the walls were built, often using a technique known as wattle and daub, where a lattice of thin wooden branches was covered with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw to create a solid barrier against the cold. The roofs of Viking homes were just as crucial to their survival as the walls and foundation. In a place where snow could accumulate in inches or feet overnight, the roof had to be designed to shed the weight of the snow and prevent it from collapsing. Viking roofs were typically steeply pitched, allowing the snow to slide off rather than building up and creating a dangerous weight. The roof structure was often made from timber beams covered with thatch or wooden shingles, and in some cases, sod or turf was used to insulate the roof further. This combination of materials helped to keep the warmth inside the longhouse while keeping the cold out. The roofs were not only functional but also served as a symbol of Viking adaptability, showing how they used their surroundings to create a home that was both practical and resilient. While timber and stone were the primary building materials, the Vikings also turned to other natural resources to enhance the insulation and functionality of their homes. Animal hides, thick woolen blankets, and furs were often used to line the walls of the longhouse, creating a barrier against the cold air that seeped in through cracks and gaps. The insulation helped to trap the heat generated by the fire in the hearth, ensuring that the space stayed warm despite the freezing temperatures outside. These additions were particularly important during the long winter months when the cold could become unbearable. The Vikings understood the importance of maintaining warmth in their homes, and every material, from wood to animal pelts, played a role in keeping their living spaces comfortable and safe. Beyond the practical considerations of construction, Viking homes were also designed with community in mind. The longhouses were typically large, open-plan structures, designed to accommodate extended families or even entire communities. The longhouse served as a gathering place, a space where people could come together for warmth, for food, and for company. The design of the longhouse was not just about providing shelter, it was about creating a space that fostered a sense of unity and cooperation. The hearth at the center of the longhouse was the focal point, providing both warmth and light. Around it, families would gather, sharing stories, food, and company as they endured the long, dark winter months together. The Viking longhouse, with its sturdy timber frame, its stone foundation, and its carefully crafted roof, was more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of the Vikings' relationship with the land and the environment. It was a manifestation of their adaptability and resourcefulness, built from the very materials that surrounded them. Each home was a testament to the Viking spirit, to their ability to survive in one of the most challenging climates on Earth, and to their deep connection to the natural world. The foundation of a Viking home was not simply physical. It was rooted in the understanding that survival was not just about enduring the elements but about shaping them, transforming the harsh northern climate into a sanctuary of warmth, safety, and community. In every aspect of their homes, the Vikings demonstrated a profound respect for the land they inhabited. They knew the materials they had at their disposal and how to use them wisely. They were not merely building homes. They were building a way of life, one that would allow them to thrive in a world that could otherwise have swallowed them whole. The use of timber and stone was not just a matter of practicality, it was an expression of the Viking worldview, a belief that the land, though harsh and unyielding, could be shaped into a refuge, a place where life could persist, even in the most extreme conditions. The Viking longhouse was more than just a shelter, it was the very heart of Viking life, culture, and survival. In an environment where the forces of nature were as unforgiving as the Viking warriors themselves, the longhouse stood as a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a people determined to endure. It was not only a home but a symbol of community, a place where families came together to weather the long, brutal winters of the north. Everything about the longhouse, from its design to its construction, was meant to ensure warmth, protection, and survival during the harshest seasons. Imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse during the height of winter. The wind howls outside, fierce and biting, and snowdrifts pile up against the walls. But inside, the warmth from the central hearth floods the room, creating a stark contrast to the cold, bleak world outside. The fire crackles and pops in the center of the longhouse, casting a flickering light on the faces of those gathered around it. There's a sense of communal warmth that goes beyond the physical heat of the fire. It's the warmth of shared experiences, of family, and of a deep connection to the land. This is where the Viking spirit thrived, together, in the safety of the longhouse, away from the dangers of the outside world. The longhouse was often quite large, long enough to accommodate an extended family, and sometimes even a small community. It was a place where generations lived side by side, each contributing to the survival and well-being of the group. This communal nature of the longhouse was crucial for Viking survival. In a world where winter could last for months, isolation could be deadly. By living together under one roof, the Vikings could pool their resources, share the burdens of survival, and ensure that no one was left to face the harsh conditions alone. Built with the finest materials available, the longhouse was designed to be both durable and insulated. The thick timber frame was sturdy enough to withstand the heavy weight of snow and the fierce winds that swept through the land. The roof, steeply pitched to shed snow, was covered with thatch or turf, providing an additional layer of insulation. The walls were often made from a combination of wood and earth, sometimes covered with moss or animal hides to keep the warmth in. The fire in the center of the longhouse was more than just a source of heat, it was the lifeblood of the home. It provided light, warmth, and a place to cook food, and it brought the family together, creating a sense of unity and security during the long nights of winter. The layout of the longhouse reflected the communal nature of Viking life. The space was often divided into different areas, with the hearth and the communal living space at the center. Surrounding the hearth were areas for sleeping, cooking, and working. The longhouse might have had a central hall where larger gatherings took place, with smaller sleeping areas for families and individuals off to the sides. The walls were lined with shelves, hooks, and racks to store tools, weapons, and food supplies. The floor was often covered with straw or animal pelts, and the walls might have been adorned with tapestries or carvings, showcasing Viking art and culture. Every element of the longhouse was designed to support daily life, ensuring that the people living within its walls had everything they needed to survive the harsh winters. The hearth was the focal point of the longhouse, the heart of both the structure and the community. It was not only a source of warmth but also a place where food was prepared, where work was done, and where stories were shared. In a time when the cold could freeze the soul as easily as it could freeze the body, the hearth was a place of comfort and connection. It was where the family gathered, where children were told stories of their ancestors, and where the Vikings' rich oral tradition was passed down from one generation to the next. The flames from the fire would dance in the dark, casting shadows on the walls as the Vikings shared tales of heroism, gods, and the struggles of survival. The importance of the longhouse as a communal space cannot be overstated. In a society where the elements could isolate you from the outside world, the longhouse was the place where everyone came together. It was the center of daily life, a space for working, resting, and socializing. The communal nature of the longhouse allowed the Vikings to band together, supporting one another through the harsh winters and making survival a shared responsibility. Whether it was tending the fire, preparing food, or keeping watch for potential threats, everyone in the longhouse played a part in the survival of the group. Within the walls of the longhouse, the Vikings created a world of their own. The bond of family was paramount, and the longhouse was a reflection of the close-knit, cooperative nature of Viking society. The longhouse was where marriages were made, where children were raised, and where old age was spent. It was where people lived and died, surrounded by their families and loved ones. In a world where death was never far away, especially during the cold, brutal winters, the longhouse was a sanctuary from the dangers of the outside world. It was a place where the Viking values of loyalty, honor, and bravery were reinforced every day, where the bond of kinship was cherished above all else. The Viking longhouse was also a place of labor and craftsmanship. The Vikings were skilled artisans, and many longhouses had areas dedicated to craftwork, carving wood, weaving textiles, forging tools, and creating weapons. The space surrounding the hearth often doubled as a workshop, where people would create the items necessary for survival. The Vikings were practical and resourceful, and their ability to craft tools, weapons, and other items from the materials available to them was essential to their survival. The Longhouse served as both a living space and a workshop, where both the physical and cultural needs of the Viking community were met. Despite the harsh conditions outside, life in the Longhouse could be surprisingly warm and vibrant. The fire would crackle through the night, the air filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the occasional song. The Longhouse was where life happened, the mundane tasks of daily survival, the joy of family, and the richness of culture. It was a place where the Viking spirit was alive, a place where the cold and the dark could be kept at bay, if only for a time. The Longhouse was also a symbol of Viking resilience. It was not just a home, it was a reflection of the Viking worldview, one that saw the elements as both a threat and a challenge to be overcome. Every aspect of the Longhouse, from its sturdy structure to its practical design, spoke to the Vikings' ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity. The Longhouse was their fortress, their sanctuary, and their gathering place. It was a place where they could rest and recharge, preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the end, the Viking Longhouse was far more than just a shelter. It was the cornerstone of Viking life. It was where they survived the long winters, where they passed down their stories, and where they formed the bonds that would carry them through the darkest times. It was the center of their world, a world where survival was not just about enduring the cold, but about finding warmth in each other and in the shared strength of community. And in that warmth, the Viking spirit flourished. In a land where winters stretched endlessly and the nights were long enough to feel like eternity, the hearth was far more than a source of warmth. It was the very heart of Viking life. It was the center of the Longhouse, a place where the darkness of the outside world was pushed back by the light of the fire. It was a space where life, in all its forms, unfolded. From cooking and eating to socializing, storytelling, and even working, the hearth played a crucial role in shaping Viking culture and survival. In the unyielding cold of the north, where the winds howled like wolves and the snow piled up like mountains, the hearth was both a literal and symbolic beacon of life. Picture yourself standing in a Viking longhouse during the dead of winter. The fire in the hearth crackles and pops, its dancing flames casting a warm, flickering glow across the walls. The warmth is a relief from the bitter cold outside, where the snow relentlessly falls, blanketing the land in a frozen silence. Inside the longhouse, however, there is life. The fire is the center of everything. It offers not only heat but light, food, and protection from the dark forces of the night. The hearth is a sacred place, where the Vikings gather to share stories, meals, and dreams. It is the lifeblood of the community, the thread that ties everyone together, even in the darkest, coldest months. The hearth was the Viking home's primary source of warmth, and its importance cannot be overstated. Without it, life in the longhouse would have been unimaginable. During the winter months, when temperatures could drop to unbearable lows, the hearth provided a refuge from the biting cold. The walls of the longhouse, while well insulated, would only offer so much protection. It was the heat from the hearth that kept the Viking family from freezing in the brutal cold. This fire, burning day and night, was what allowed families to survive through the darkest seasons. The hearth was a source of comfort, a place where Vikings could gather to escape the harshness of the world outside, if only for a few hours. But the hearth was more than just a heat source. It was the Viking center of activity. It was where food was prepared, where warriors rested after a long day's work, and where families came together to share in the simple pleasures of life. The flames that leapt from the hearth were the backdrop for meals, for laughter, for quiet conversations, and for the telling of stories. As the fire flickered, the smell of roasting meat or boiling stew would fill the air, making the longhouse smell like home. The hearth's warmth brought families closer, physically and emotionally. It was the place where bonds were forged, where children learned from their parents, and where the generations came together to build a shared future. For the Vikings, food was a vital part of their culture, and the hearth was where the majority of their meals were prepared. With limited resources and a need to preserve what they had, The Vikings made use of every scrap of food they could obtain. Meat, fish, grains, and vegetables were carefully preserved during the summer and fall months so that they could be used during the winter. The hearth became the place where all this stored food was transformed into nourishing meals. Large pots would simmer on the fire, making stews and broths that would sustain the Vikings through the cold months. The hearth was not just a cooking tool, it was a communal space for sharing meals, a moment of connection in the midst of the isolation of winter. However, the hearth was not only used for cooking. It was the center of the Viking social structure, a place where stories were told, traditions were passed down, and the rich oral history of the Viking people was kept alive. As the fire burned, the men and women of the Longhouse would sit around it, recounting tales of their ancestors, gods, and heroes. The flames seemed to add an element of magic to these stories, casting shadows on the walls as if to bring the past to life. The hearth, in this sense, was not just a place for survival, it was a place for remembering, for honoring the past, and for forging the future. The tales shared around the fire would help to bind the Viking community together, creating a sense of unity and shared purpose. The hearth also had a spiritual significance for the Vikings. Fire was often seen as a sacred element, a powerful force that could protect the home and the people within it. The hearth was not just a physical space, it was also a symbol of warmth, light, and life. The Vikings believed that fire had the power to ward off evil spirits and to keep the darkness at bay. They would often make offerings or sacrifices to the gods, lighting small fires or offering food to ensure their protection and favor. The hearth, in this sense, was a sacred space, a connection between the human and the divine. In the flickering light of the flames, the Vikings felt a sense of closeness to their ancestors, to the gods, and to the land itself. Beyond its warmth and its practical use, the hearth was also a place of protection. The fire served as a deterrent to the wild creatures that roamed the north, from wolves to bears to other predators. The Vikings understood the dangers of the wilderness, and the hearth was a key component of their strategy for safety. It kept animals away from the home and created a barrier between the family and the harsh elements. It was also a place where weapons could be hung or repaired, where tools were kept sharp and ready. The hearth, with its glow, provided not just physical warmth but also a sense of security, a reminder that in the heart of the home, the Viking family was safe from the dangers of the outside world. As the nights grew longer and the cold intensified, the hearth became an even more vital part of daily life. During the winter months, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, it was easy to feel lost in the darkness. The hearth's fire pushed back the darkness, both literally and figuratively. It provided the light needed to continue with the day's work, to tend to the animals, to prepare food, and to care for children. But more than that, the fire symbolized hope. It was the constant, unwavering flame that reminded the Vikings that even in the harshest winters, life would continue. The hearth was a symbol of endurance, of the human will to survive against all odds. The Viking hearth was also a place for the exchange of knowledge. It was where elders would teach the younger generation the skills needed to survive, how to hunt, how to farm, how to make tools, and how to navigate the seas. These lessons were often imparted in the form of stories, passed down from parent to child, from elder to youth. Around the fire, children learned the values of their people: courage, loyalty, respect, and endurance. They learned of their ancestors' deeds, the gods they worshipped, and the history that shaped their present. The hearth, in this way, was not just a center of survival, it was a place of education, of learning, and of cultural continuity. In every Viking longhouse, the hearth was a vital presence, a force that brought warmth, light, food, safety, and connection. It was where the Viking family came together to survive the darkest months of winter, where they built bonds that would last a lifetime. It was a place of community, of shared stories, and of shared history. The hearth was the symbol of life in the north, and in its fire, the Viking spirit endured even through the coldest, darkest nights. In the face of the unforgiving northern winters, the Vikings were more than mere survivors, they were masters of ingenuity. Faced with a harsh environment where temperatures could plummet to bone-chilling lows, they had to become resourceful in ways that most people in milder climates could never imagine. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their seafaring exploits and their warrior prowess, their true genius lay in how they adapted their homes and their daily lives to survive the bitter cold. It was through a combination of materials, architectural techniques, and innovative methods that the Vikings made their homes not only livable but relatively comfortable during the long, dark winters. To fully appreciate the Viking approach to insulation, one must first understand the brutal nature of the cold they endured. Scandinavian winters were long and harsh, with the snow sometimes piling up in drifts so high that villages would be buried under layers of white. The winds, often howling in from the icy north, could freeze the very air itself, turning it into a biting force that felt like sharp needles against the skin. Without the technology we have today, the Vikings had to rely on what was available in their environment to create homes that could protect them from such extreme conditions. The first line of defense against the cold was the construction of the home itself. The Viking longhouse, their signature dwelling, was built with the northern climate in mind. Timber was the primary building material, not only because of its availability but also because of its insulating properties. The thick beams that formed the skeleton of the longhouse were carefully chosen for their durability, and they provided a sturdy frame that could withstand the pressure of snow and the battering of winds. Timber, when used properly, could trap air between the layers of wood, creating a natural insulation against the cold. But timber alone was not enough to keep the cold at bay. To truly make the longhouse livable in the face of the brutal winter, the Vikings needed to go a step further. One of the most important techniques they used was to build their homes into the earth itself. Digging down into the ground, the Vikings created homes that were partially subterranean. This technique provided a natural form of insulation, as the Earth's temperature remained relatively constant throughout the year. In winter, the ground acted as a barrier to the freezing cold, keeping the interior of the longhouse warmer than the outside air. This built-in insulation was especially effective in areas where timber was less abundant, allowing the Vikings to make the most of the land they lived on. The walls of the Viking longhouse were another crucial component of insulation. While the walls were often made from timber, they were not simply constructed by stacking logs on top of each other. Instead, the Vikings used a technique known as wattle and daub, in which a framework of wooden branches was woven together and then coated with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. This method not only added strength and stability to the walls but also provided an extra layer of insulation against the cold. The wattle and daub method was particularly effective at blocking out drafts, which were one of the most significant challenges in Viking homes. By sealing the gaps between the wooden framework, the Vikings ensured that the warmth generated by the hearth in the center of the longhouse stayed inside, rather than escaping through the cracks. In addition to the walls, the roof of the longhouse was another critical element in the battle against the cold. Viking roofs were typically steeply pitched, which allowed the snow to slide off rather than accumulate and add weight to the structure. The roofs were covered with a variety of materials, depending on what was available in the region. In some areas, the Vikings used thatch, a material made from straw or reeds, which provided some insulation while also being lightweight enough to prevent the roof from collapsing under the weight of heavy snow. In other regions, they used turf or sod, which provided a much better insulating barrier. The thick layers of turf, often layered with earth and moss, created an effective thermal blanket that kept the warmth inside the longhouse and the cold outside. But insulation wasn't just about the structure. It was about how the Vikings used the materials available to them to make their homes as comfortable as possible. One of the most ingenious techniques they employed was the use of animal hides and furs. These were not just luxury items, they were a necessity. The Vikings used animal pelts to line the walls of the longhouse, draping them over the framework or hanging them from the rafters to create additional insulation. These hides provided a natural barrier against the cold, trapping heat inside while also absorbing moisture from the air. In the absence of modern heating systems, the use of animal skins was an essential part of Viking home insulation, allowing them to maintain a livable temperature inside their homes. Inside the longhouse, the hearth was, of course, the primary source of heat. The fire in the center of the home not only provided warmth but also served as the heart of Viking social life. The placement of the hearth in the middle of the longhouse ensured that heat was distributed evenly throughout the space. The warmth from the fire would radiate outwards, filling the entire room and keeping the occupants comfortable. However, without proper insulation, even the best fire could quickly dissipate, leaving the room just as cold as the outside. The Vikings understood this, and their careful use of materials, combined with their expert construction techniques, allowed them to keep the heat inside and the cold outside. Another important feature of Viking homes that contributed to insulation was the design of the doors and windows. While many Viking homes had small, low doors to prevent heat from escaping, windows were a rare commodity. Instead of glass, Viking windows were often covered with thin animal hides or shutters made of wood, which helped to block out the wind while still allowing some light to filter in. The lack of large windows may have made the interiors of Viking homes seem dark, but it was a practical solution to the problem of heat loss. The limited amount of light in the home was more than made up for by the warmth of the fire and the closeness of the community. The Viking longhouse was more than just a physical structure. It was a reflection of the Viking way of life. It was a testament to their ability to adapt to their environment, to use the resources at their disposal to create a home that was not only functional but livable in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Through their use of timber, stone, earth, animal hides, and innovative construction techniques, the Vikings were able to insulate their homes in ways that allowed them to survive the cold, dark winters of the North. Their homes were not just shelters, they were sanctuaries, carefully designed and crafted to keep the cold at bay and to create a space where life could continue even when the world outside seemed determined to freeze over. The Viking longhouse, with its ingenious insulation techniques, stood as a symbol of human ingenuity, resilience, and the deep connection between the Vikings and the land they called home. In the harsh, frozen expanse of the Viking world, where the cold could numb the spirit as easily as it could freeze the flesh, the fire was the beating heart of every Viking home. It was more than a mere source of heat. It was essential to survival. The fire provided warmth against the bitter chill of winter. It cooked meals that sustained the Vikings during the long months of isolation, and it was the central point around which life revolved. Without fire, the Vikings would not have survived the long, dark winters of the North. It was through the careful management of fire that they were able to maintain their strength, resilience, and sense of community. The Viking hearth was not simply a fireplace. It was a multifaceted tool that played a crucial role in nearly every aspect of daily life. Positioned at the center of the longhouse, the hearth was strategically placed to ensure that its heat and light would spread throughout the home. The fire in the hearth was the primary source of warmth, and it could easily be the difference between life and death when the temperatures outside plunged to dangerous levels. The hearth acted as a gathering point for families and clans, providing both a literal and emotional center. As the fire crackled and sparked, it illuminated the faces of those who gathered around it, creating a sense of unity and connection despite the isolation of winter. Viking homes were often designed with the hearth in mind, ensuring that the fire's warmth would permeate the entire longhouse. The longhouse itself, with its central hearth, was usually constructed in such a way that the fire's heat could travel through the home, warming the living spaces and providing comfort during the coldest of nights. The design was not just practical, it was symbolic. The hearth represented the life force of the home, the lifeblood that kept the community alive during the darkest months of the year. But fire was not just used to provide warmth. It was the means by which Vikings cooked their food, preserving and preparing it for the long winter months. The Viking diet relied heavily on food that could be stored and preserved: meat, fish, grains, and root vegetables. But these foods, which were stored in preparation for the lean winter months, needed to be cooked in order to be consumed. The fire in the hearth was crucial for cooking these meals. Large cauldrons would hang above the fire, filled with stews, soups, and broths made from dried meat, salted fish, and root vegetables. The warmth from the fire made these meals possible, ensuring that the Vikings could eat enough to stay strong and healthy throughout the winter. The fire was also used to prepare food through smoking and drying, methods that the Vikings had perfected over generations. Meat, fish, and even berries were hung over the fire to dry, preserving them for later use. These dried foods became staples of the Viking diet, providing sustenance when fresh food was not available. The Vikings' ability to dry and smoke food was critical to their survival, allowing them to create reserves of food that could last throughout the long winters. The fire, therefore, was not only an essential tool for immediate survival but also a method of food preservation, ensuring that the Vikings would have enough to eat when the outside world was covered in snow and ice. Beyond the practical aspects of warmth and food, the fire was also the center of Viking social life. The hearth was the heart of the longhouse, and it was around the fire that families and communities would gather to share stories, bond, and pass down traditions. In a time when most entertainment consisted of oral traditions, the fire became the stage for the recounting of sagas, legends, and heroic tales. Elders would sit by the fire and recount stories of the gods, the great heroes of Viking history, and the deeds of their ancestors. These stories were more than just entertainment, they were an essential part of Viking culture, teaching younger generations about their heritage, their values, and their place in the world. The hearth was also the place where Viking customs and rituals were performed. Sacrifices and offerings to the gods were often made in the presence of the fire, as the flames were believed to carry prayers and offerings to the divine. It was not uncommon for Viking families to burn incense, oils, or even food to honor the gods and seek their protection and favor. The fire, in this sense, was both a physical and spiritual force, linking the people of the Longhouse to the forces of nature and the divine world. The role of fire in Viking society went beyond the home and the Longhouse. In the Viking settlements, where the cold could render the outside world even more perilous, fire was used as a tool for survival in other ways. It was essential in the crafting of weapons, tools, and boats, items that were necessary for hunting, farming, and raiding. Blacksmiths relied on the fire to heat metal, forging swords, axes, and shields that were crucial to Viking success on the battlefield. The Viking shipbuilders also relied on fire to shape the timber used to construct their legendary longships. These ships, which were not only used for exploration and raiding but also for trade and transport, were built with the assistance of the fire, which helped to bend and shape the wood to the correct form. In the forests of Scandinavia, where wood was abundant but the winter was long and harsh, fire also played a role in maintaining the safety of Viking villages. The Vikings, always wary of external threats, often used fire as a deterrent against wild animals, such as wolves or bears, which could pose a danger during the long winter months. The flames from the hearth, when maintained and tended to properly, would ward off these predators, keeping the village safe. At the same time, fire acted as a beacon, allowing members of the community to navigate the darkness, whether they were coming back from a long day of work in the fields or returning from a hunting trip. In Viking society, fire was also associated with purification and renewal. Just as fire had the power to destroy, it was also believed to have the power to purify, clearing away the old to make way for the new. This belief was reflected in many Viking rituals, where fire was used to cleanse the spirit and the body. For example, after a long journey or a successful raid, Viking warriors would often perform rituals involving fire to cleanse themselves of any impurities and to honor the gods for their protection. Fire, in this sense, was not just a practical tool, it was a symbol of transformation, a force that could bring renewal and life to the people who respected its power. Throughout all these uses, fire was an ever-present force in the daily lives of the Vikings. It was a tool of survival, a means of connecting with the divine, and a symbol of the Viking way of life. From its role in heating and cooking to its spiritual significance, the fire was at the center of the Viking world. It was a force that provided light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, and sustenance in the harshest of seasons. Without fire, the Vikings would not have survived the cold northern winters. It was through their mastery of fire that they were able to thrive in an environment that would have otherwise been unbearable. The fire in the Viking hearth was a beacon of resilience, innovation, and community, key traits that defined the Viking people. In the frozen expanse of the Viking world, where the land could be as unforgiving as the ice-capped seas, every tool, every technique, every craft was essential to survival. The Vikings, known for their remarkable ability to adapt to the harshest of environments, were not just warriors and explorers, they were expert craftsmen, builders, and innovators. The homes they constructed in the brutal winters of the north were not just shelters, they were masterpieces of functional design, crafted with an intricate understanding of the natural world and the materials available to them. The tools they used and the techniques they perfected were essential for building the structures that could withstand the unforgiving climate and provide warmth, safety, and stability. The Viking longhouse was a perfect example of this ingenuity. To build such a structure, the Vikings relied on a combination of tools that ranged from simple handheld implements to more complex machinery that they had devised. The basic toolset of a Viking craftsman included axes, knives, hammers, and adzes, tools that were forged from metal and designed for efficiency and precision. These tools allowed the Vikings to fell trees, carve timber, and construct buildings that were as durable as they were functional. While these tools were relatively simple compared to modern construction equipment, they were more than sufficient to meet the demands of building in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The Viking axe, for example, was one of their most iconic and versatile tools. Not only was it a weapon of war, but it was also indispensable in the construction of homes. The Vikings used axes to chop down trees, trim branches, and shape logs. The design of the Viking axe was both practical and effective, with a broad, flat blade that could be used for a variety of tasks. Whether felling large trees for the longhouse frame or shaping smaller logs for the roof, the axe was a tool that could be relied upon for almost every aspect of construction. The Vikings understood that the quality of their homes depended on the precision of their tools, and their axes were designed to deliver just that. Once the timber was cut, it needed to be shaped and prepared for construction. This is where the Viking adze came into play. An adze is similar to an axe, but it has a blade that is set at a right angle to the handle, allowing it to be used for shaping and smoothing wood. With the adze, the Vikings could carefully shape beams, planks, and posts, creating the framework of the longhouse. The adze allowed for fine, detailed work, making it possible to fit the beams together with great precision. The ability to craft such sturdy and well-crafted wooden structures was one of the reasons why Viking homes were able to withstand the harsh winter storms. The care and attention to detail that went into shaping the wood helped ensure that each structure would endure for years, if not decades. But building a Viking home wasn't just about cutting and shaping wood. It was also about how the wood was connected. The Vikings used a technique known as mortise and tenon to join the beams of the longhouse. This technique involved carving a hole, the mortise, in one piece of wood and then shaping a protruding piece, the tenon, on another, so that the two could fit together tightly. Mortise and tenon joints were incredibly strong and allowed the Vikings to construct buildings that were not only stable but also capable of withstanding the elements. These joints were secured with wooden pegs, which were hammered into place to lock the beams together, creating a structure that could endure the weight of snow, the force of the wind, and the test of time. Once the frame of the longhouse was in place, the Vikings turned to the next crucial aspect of construction, the walls. As timber alone could not provide sufficient protection against the cold, the Vikings employed the wattle and daub technique, which combined the use of wood with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The wattle was made from thin branches woven into a lattice pattern, which formed the frame of the walls. The daub was then applied over the wattle, filling in the gaps and creating a thick, insulating layer. The mixture of mud, clay, and straw not only provided protection from the cold but also helped to keep out the wind and rain. The wattle and daub walls were a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity, using natural materials in a way that maximized their insulating properties. The Vikings also paid careful attention to the roofing of their longhouses. The roof was one of the most critical components in ensuring the home could survive the weight of heavy snow and fierce winter storms. The Vikings typically used a steeply pitched roof design, which allowed snow to slide off easily rather than accumulating and risking the collapse of the structure. The roofs were covered with thatch, turf, or shingles, depending on the materials available in the region. Thatching, which involved layering reeds or straw to create a waterproof barrier, was a common roofing technique. The roof was also often insulated with layers of earth or moss, which helped to keep the heat inside and protect the inhabitants from the cold. In regions where timber was scarce, the Vikings also used stone in the construction of their homes. Stone foundations were often laid to provide stability and insulation from the cold earth. In some areas, stone was even used in the walls, especially for homes that were built into hillsides or rocky terrain. The use of stone, combined with the insulating properties of earth and turf, provided an extra layer of protection from the harsh cold. The Vikings understood the importance of utilizing the resources available to them, and they knew how to combine materials in a way that maximized their effectiveness. The building of Viking homes also relied on the use of more specialized tools. For example, the Vikings used tools like chisels and scrapers to carve intricate designs and details into their homes. These tools allowed for the creation of decorative elements such as carvings and symbols that were often placed around doorways or along the beams of the longhouse. These carvings were not just ornamental, they often held spiritual or symbolic meaning, representing protection, strength, or the blessings of the gods. The Vikings believed that these carvings could ward off evil spirits and protect the home from harm. But it wasn't just the construction of the home itself that required skill and craftsmanship. It was also the ability to maintain the home and ensure that it remained functional through the long winters. Viking tools were essential for everyday tasks such as repairing tools, maintaining weapons, and crafting other necessary items. The Vikings' ability to craft tools was central to their ability to thrive in the harsh conditions of the north. They had a deep understanding of materials, whether metal, wood, or stone, and they used this knowledge to create items that would help them survive and flourish. In addition to building homes, the Vikings used their tools to craft boats, weapons, and tools for farming. The Viking longship, for example, required advanced carpentry skills, with carefully shaped wooden planks fastened together using a combination of nails and iron rivets. The longship's sleek design made it capable of withstanding the rough seas, but it also required expert knowledge of woodworking and shipbuilding techniques. Similarly, Viking weapons, axes, swords, and spears were forged with great skill, using fire and metalworking techniques that were passed down through generations. Through their mastery of tools and techniques, the Vikings were able to construct homes that were not only functional but also designed to stand the test of time. The Viking longhouse was an embodiment of their ability to adapt to their environment, using available resources in creative ways to build structures that could protect them from the cold, the wind, and the storms. The craftsmanship and skill required to build these homes were a reflection of the Viking way of life, one that was built on resilience, innovation, and a deep connection to the natural world. The Vikings were a people whose survival in the harsh northern winters demanded more than just ingenuity and resilience. It required deep spiritual and cultural practices that helped them endure the long, dark months of cold. Their connection to the land, the seasons, and the ever-present forces of nature formed the foundation of their beliefs, guiding them through the most challenging periods of the year. Winter, in particular, was not just a season to endure. It was a time steeped in rituals, celebrations, and observances that offered both comfort and protection. These winter rituals were vital to maintaining not only physical survival but also the mental and spiritual fortitude necessary to thrive in the frozen expanse of the north. The Viking year was marked by the cycles of nature, and the approach of winter was a time when the people turned inward, both literally and figuratively. As the days grew shorter and the nights stretched longer, the Vikings retreated into their homes, where they would gather around the hearth, the heart of their domestic life, and prepare for the months of isolation ahead. Yet this period of retreat was also one of intense spiritual and social activity. The Vikings understood that winter was not simply a cold, lifeless time. It was a period in which the boundary between the living and the supernatural grew thin. It was a time when they could draw closer to their gods, ancestors, and spirits. One of the most significant winter rituals for the Vikings was the celebration of the Midwinter Festival, which we know today as Yule, a holiday that has had a lasting influence on many of our modern winter traditions. Yule marked the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night of the year, and was a time for honoring the rebirth of the sun. For the Vikings, Yule was not only a celebration of the return of light but also a time to give thanks for the blessings of the year past and to ensure the protection and prosperity of the year to come. It was believed that during this time, the gods, particularly the sun goddess Sol, would begin their journey back toward the earth, bringing longer days and warmer weather. Yule was a time of feasting, singing, and offering sacrifices. The Viking people believed that their well-being for the coming year depended on their relationship with the divine, and during Yule, they would make offerings to the gods and spirits in exchange for protection and blessings. Animal sacrifices, particularly of pigs and cattle, were commonly made during these rituals, as the Vikings believed that these offerings would appease the gods and ensure a bountiful harvest in the spring. The blood from these sacrifices would often be smeared on the altars or on the walls of the longhouse, a symbolic gesture meant to invite the gods into the home and ensure their favor. The Vikings also observed a number of other winter customs to protect their homes and families. The cold and darkness of winter were seen as an invitation for spirits, both benevolent and malevolent, to enter the human realm. To protect themselves from these spiritual forces, the Vikings would perform rituals to ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune. The use of charms, amulets, and talismans was common, as these objects were believed to have protective powers. The Vikings were deeply superstitious, and they believed that the supernatural world was just as real as the physical one. These winter rituals, which might involve chanting incantations or making offerings to the spirits of the land, were designed to keep the Vikings safe from the forces that lurked in the darkness. Alongside the rituals to protect their homes and communities, the Vikings also looked to their ancestors for guidance. Winter was a time when they would honor their forebears, asking for strength and wisdom. The dead were believed to play an active role in the lives of the living, and the Vikings would often make offerings of food, drink, or other goods to their ancestors. The Vikings' deep respect for their ancestors was reflected in their belief that the spirits of the dead could provide protection, guidance, and even intervention in the living world. This connection to the past helped the Vikings face the future with confidence, knowing that their ancestors were watching over them. In the Longhouses, the hearth played a central role in these rituals. The warmth of the fire, which was the heart of the home, was also a bridge between the living and the spiritual realms. The hearth was seen as a symbol of life and vitality, but also of the sacred. It was around the fire that stories of the gods, heroes, and ancestors were told, reinforcing the bond between the past and the present. It was during these long winter nights that the Vikings would gather together to share tales of great warriors, of Odin and Thor, of battles fought and won, and of journeys across the seas. These stories, passed down through generations, were not just entertainment, they were a form of spiritual nourishment, a way to connect with the divine and to ensure the continuation of Viking culture and values. Winter was also a time for seers and shamans, who played a crucial role in Viking society, particularly during the colder months when the veil between worlds was thought to be thinnest. These spiritual leaders, often women known as vulvas or seeresses, would perform divinations and communicate with the gods and spirits on behalf of the people. They were believed to have the power to see into the future, to predict the coming harvests, and to foretell events that would shape the fate of the community. In the winter months, the vulvas would be sought out for their wisdom and insight, and their rituals would often involve the use of herbs, chants, and sacrifices to the spirits. Another vital winter ritual was the lighting of candles or torches. In the long, dark nights of winter, fire became a symbol of hope and renewal. The Vikings would light torches in their homes and around their villages, creating a glow that would push back the darkness and symbolize the triumph of light over darkness. This was not just a practical act of illumination but also a deeply symbolic one. The flickering flames were believed to hold the power to chase away the spirits of the dark, ensuring that the living would be protected until the sun returned. During the coldest months, when travel was difficult and the seas were treacherous, the Vikings also focused on their indoor crafts and preparations for the coming year. It was a time for mending weapons, preparing tools, and crafting the items needed for the next season's raids, trades, and farming. This time of preparation was not only practical but also spiritual. The act of preparing for the future, of ensuring that everything was in order for the coming spring, was seen as an act of respect for the gods and the natural world. By ensuring that everything was ready for the thaw, the Vikings believed that they were demonstrating their readiness for whatever challenges the coming year might bring. The connection between the Vikings and the cold was not one of simple endurance, it was one of reverence. The winter months were a time of spiritual reflection, a period when the forces of nature were both feared and respected. The rituals of winter allowed the Vikings to navigate the darkness, to find light in the cold, and to ensure that they remained connected to both their ancestors and the divine. These practices were vital to their sense of identity, of belonging, and of purpose. As the cold winds howled outside, the Vikings huddled together in their longhouses, drawing strength from each other, from their gods, and from the timeless rituals that had been passed down through generations. It was through these practices that they found the strength to not only survive but thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. In the harsh, unforgiving winters of the Viking world, when survival often depended on every member of the household, women played an indispensable role. While Viking warriors and seafarers are often the figures most celebrated in history, the true resilience of Viking society was underpinned by the strength, ingenuity, and resourcefulness of the women who kept the home fires burning. The Viking longhouse, the center of community and survival, was not just the domain of men. Women were the heart of the household. They were the guardians of the hearth, the managers of the home, and the nurturers who ensured that the family survived through the coldest, most isolating months of the year. In the winter months, when travel became difficult and external resources were harder to obtain, the role of women was even more pronounced. The Vikings, deeply connected to the land and their environment, understood that winter was a time when the external world could become a place of peril. Food became scarce, the land lay dormant under layers of snow, and the cold could seep into the bones of even the strongest warrior. It was within this environment that women truly became the backbone of Viking society, ensuring that the hearth remained warm, the children were cared for, and the household was kept in order. One of the most crucial responsibilities women had during the winter was managing the food supply. While the men may have hunted and gathered food during the warmer months, it was often the women who took charge of preserving and preparing these supplies for the long winters ahead. The Vikings were experts in food preservation. Through drying, salting, smoking, and pickling, they ensured that the food stored during the harvest months would last through the winter. Women played a central role in this process, working long hours to prepare and store meats, fish, and grains for the coming months. They would also prepare herbal concoctions and brews to treat illnesses or boost the immune system, keeping their families healthy during the harsh cold. In addition to preserving food, women were responsible for the daily preparation of meals. During the winter, cooking took on added importance. The hearth, which served as both the center of warmth and the focal point for social gatherings, was also the place where food was cooked. Women would spend hours tending to the fire, ensuring that there was enough heat to cook stews, soups, and broths, meals that could sustain their families during the long, dark months. These meals, often simple but nourishing, were made from the preserved foods they had worked so hard to prepare earlier in the year. The hearth was the focal point of the home, and it was the women who ensured that it was kept fed, not just with food, but with the warmth and love that kept the family united. But Viking women's contributions did not stop at food preparation. They were also responsible for maintaining the home, which was an arduous task during the winter months. In a time before modern insulation, the Viking longhouse would have been drafty, cold, and constantly exposed to the elements. Women spent considerable time and effort ensuring that the structure of the house was intact and that the warmth from the hearth was not lost. They would patch any holes or gaps in the walls and roof, often using materials such as animal hides or clay to seal drafts. If the family lived in a more remote area, they might also be tasked with collecting firewood and other materials needed to sustain the hearth through the long winter. This was not a job for the faint of heart, as it required long hours in the cold and a strong back to carry wood or materials over snowy terrain. Another vital responsibility of Viking women during the winter months was the care of livestock. In a society where the survival of the community often depended on animals, women were tasked with ensuring that the family's cattle, sheep, goats, and other livestock were well fed and protected from the brutal cold. They would tend to the animals, providing food, cleaning their living spaces, and ensuring that they were safe from predators and the elements. In the winter, this could be particularly challenging as the animals needed more care and attention to survive the cold temperatures. Women were often the ones who carried out these tasks, ensuring that the livestock were healthy and that the resources they provided, whether it was milk, wool, or meat, remained available throughout the season. Beyond the practical tasks of survival, Viking women were also the emotional and spiritual anchors of their homes. The long, dark winters could be a time of isolation and despair, as the days were short and the cold made it difficult to venture beyond the protection of the longhouse. During these months, the hearth became more than just a physical source of warmth. It became a place of emotional sustenance, a space where families could come together to share stories, laughter, and love. Women were the custodians of this space, ensuring that the hearth was not only a place of physical comfort but also a place of emotional and spiritual connection. They would share stories passed down through generations, teaching their children about their heritage, the gods, and the values that defined Viking society. These stories were not just entertainment, they were a vital part of the community's identity, reinforcing the bonds that held the family and society together. In addition to storytelling, women were responsible for the spiritual health of the household. The Vikings had a deep connection to their gods, ancestors, and the natural world, and it was often the women who ensured that the home remained in harmony with these forces. They would perform small rituals to honor the gods, offer sacrifices to ensure a good harvest, or invoke blessings for the health and protection of the family. In the dark, cold months of winter, when the boundary between the living and the dead was believed to be thinnest, these rituals took on particular importance. Women would make offerings of food, drink, or trinkets to the gods and ancestors, ensuring that their family received their protection and guidance in the coming year. Women were also involved in the creation of clothing, textiles, and other items needed to survive the winter. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, and sewing garments were all tasks that were primarily undertaken by women in Viking society. The longhouse itself was often filled with the sounds of spinning wheels, looms, and needles as women worked tirelessly to create the clothing, blankets, and other textiles needed to keep their families warm. These garments were not just practical, they were often beautifully crafted, with intricate designs that reflected the culture and craftsmanship of Viking society. Women's role in the creation of textiles was so essential that they often played a central role in the social fabric of their communities, hosting gatherings to exchange skills, share stories, and reinforce bonds. Despite the central role women played in Viking society, their contributions were often overlooked in the narratives that have come down through history. While Viking men gained fame as warriors and explorers, it was the women who kept the home fires burning, who ensured that the family survived the winter, and who upheld the values, traditions, and spirituality of their people. The Viking winter was not just a time for warriors to prepare for battle, it was a time for women to demonstrate their strength, wisdom, and resilience, ensuring that their homes, families, and communities endured until the thaw of spring. The contributions of Viking women during the winter months were integral to the survival of the Viking way of life. Without their ingenuity, hard work, and dedication, the community could not have thrived in such an inhospitable environment. Their roles as caregivers, homemakers, spiritual guides, and community leaders were essential to the fabric of Viking society. In the cold and isolation of winter, it was the women who truly held the family together, making sure that the hearth remained warm and that life continued, even when the world outside was frozen and dark. In the Viking world, the arrival of winter brought more than just a shift in the weather. It signified a time when the long, dark months would stretch on endlessly, and every aspect of life had to adapt to the biting cold and limited sunlight. The Viking people, known for their adaptability and resourcefulness, faced not only the physical challenges of surviving in such a harsh environment but also the mental and emotional toll of enduring long periods of isolation and darkness. As the days shortened and the sun remained elusive, the Vikings developed profound strategies to not only survive but thrive during these months. Their resilience, both physical and mental, was a critical part of their ability to navigate the deep cold and darkness of the north. The most obvious challenge that winter posed to the Vikings was the lack of daylight. In regions like Scandinavia, the winter solstice meant that for weeks, the sun would scarcely rise above the horizon. The persistent darkness could be a heavy burden on the psyche, and yet the Vikings found ways to adapt, both practically and spiritually, to the absence of light. The solution to this challenge lay partly in the use of fire and the ways in which it became the focal point of daily life. In Viking homes, the hearth was not just a source of heat, it was the source of light, a beacon in the long, dark nights. The fire illuminated the space, creating a sense of warmth and comfort that was essential for maintaining a sense of normalcy during the winter months. But beyond the physical benefits of light, the fire was also symbolic. It represented hope and resilience, offering a visual reminder that even in the darkest times, life persisted. This symbolic power of the fire was deeply ingrained in Viking culture. It was around the hearth that families gathered, not just to cook food or stay warm, but to share stories, sing songs, and connect with each other. The act of sitting around the fire, telling tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors, was a way of fostering a sense of community and belonging during a time when isolation could feel overwhelming. The hearth became a shared source of emotional and psychological warmth, helping to combat the mental strain that came with the winter darkness. The Vikings also adapted their physical routines to accommodate the challenges of the long winter nights. While the men might spend the winter months repairing weapons, making preparations for the coming year's raids, or working on other crafts, the women were busy with the daily tasks of survival, cooking, preserving food, tending to the livestock, and keeping the household running. The need for constant activity was a practical way to maintain both physical and mental resilience. The more active people remained, the less likely they were to fall victim to the physical and emotional toll of the cold and isolation. Physical labor during the winter also served a deeper purpose in maintaining a sense of normalcy. In the absence of outdoor activities like farming or raiding, the Vikings often turned to crafts and handiwork as a way to occupy their time and keep their minds sharp. Women spent long hours weaving, spinning, sewing, and crafting, not just for survival but also for the sheer purpose of maintaining their mental well-being. The tactile nature of these activities provided a sense of purpose, as did the ability to create items that could be used by the family or traded. Even in the darkest times, these activities helped maintain a feeling of accomplishment and progress, ensuring that the Vikings did not become overwhelmed by the oppressive stillness of winter. One of the most powerful ways the Vikings adapted to the darkness was through their spiritual practices. The Vikings had a deep connection to the natural world and understood that the seasons were governed by forces far beyond their control. During the long winter months, when the sun seemed distant and the cold was relentless, their spiritual beliefs provided a framework for understanding and coping with the natural world. Winter, with its darkness and cold, was seen as a time when the gods were closest, and the Vikings believed that the veil between the living and the divine was thinnest during this period. It was a time when they could call upon the gods for protection, guidance, and strength. Rituals and sacrifices played a critical role in maintaining a sense of control and connection during the winter months. The Vikings believed that their survival depended on maintaining the favor of the gods, and during the long winter nights, they would perform rituals to honor their gods, particularly those associated with the sun and light. The Midwinter Festival, or Yule, was the most significant of these rituals. Held around the winter solstice, it marked the rebirth of the sun and the promise of brighter days ahead. Yule was a time of feasting, singing, and making offerings to the gods to ensure that the coming year would bring prosperity, health, and safety. The ritual lighting of candles and torches during this time symbolized the return of the sun, providing a psychological boost to the community and reinforcing the belief that the darkness would eventually give way to the light. Even in the absence of a formal religious structure, the Vikings maintained a deep respect for the rhythms of nature and the unseen forces that governed the world. These spiritual beliefs helped them endure the mental challenges of winter, as they found meaning in the darkness and cold rather than succumbing to despair. They believed that the darkness was not a permanent state, but a temporary challenge that could be overcome through perseverance, faith, and community. In addition to spiritual practices, the Vikings adapted to the darkness through their connection to community. Winter, with its isolation, could have been a time of loneliness, but instead, the Vikings turned inward to strengthen their bonds with their families and neighbors. During the long nights, it was common for the Vikings to gather in their homes and share stories. These tales, often passed down from generation to generation, provided both entertainment and a sense of continuity. The stories of their gods, heroes, and ancestors were a source of pride and identity, helping to maintain a sense of purpose and belonging even when the world outside was buried in snow and ice. The bonds of kinship and community were what held the Vikings together during these trying times, reinforcing their collective strength and resilience. The mental fortitude required to survive the Viking winters was also tied to their strong sense of purpose and duty. The Vikings were a warrior culture, and this sense of duty was central to their identity. While the winter months were not conducive to raiding or warfare, the time was not wasted. The Vikings used this period to prepare for the future, to train, to hone their skills, and to plan for the next season. This constant preparation helped them stay focused and forward-thinking, even when the physical world seemed to slow to a standstill. The Vikings understood that survival was not just about enduring the present but also about preparing for what was to come. This mindset helped them overcome the challenges of winter, knowing that each day brought them one step closer to the next opportunity to thrive. In the extreme conditions of the Viking world, the mental and physical resilience of the people was tested year after year. The darkness and cold of winter presented challenges that were as much psychological as they were physical. Yet, through their resourcefulness, spiritual practices, and deep sense of community, the Vikings were able to adapt and find strength in the face of adversity. The long winter nights became a time not just to survive but to prepare, to reflect, and to find meaning in the natural cycles of the world. For the Vikings, winter was not a time of defeat but a season that tested their resilience and reaffirmed their connection to the land, the gods, and each other. Through their unwavering determination, the Vikings endured and emerged from the darkness, ready to face the challenges of the coming year.